Actor Matthew Perry became a pop culture icon, playing the character Chandler in the legendary sitcom Friends. But Perry's rise to fame did not come without a price. He struggled mightily with addiction, both during the filming of Friends and afterwards. Matthew spoke publicly about his battles and wrote about it in his 2022 memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. Fans were heartbroken when Perry died in his hot tub in 2023 at the age of 54. His cause of death, the acute effects of the drug ketamine. After his death, everyone wondered, where did Perry get the drugs that killed him? And today, federal prosecutors say they know the answer and have arrested 5 people, including Perry's assistant, a doctor, and a North Hollywood woman known as the Ketamine Queen. Tonight, we will tell you the story of how Matthew Perry was killed. I'm Benny Politan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight here on Closing Arguments. It was very shocking. It was tragic, the death of Matthew Perry. We knew he had struggles with addiction, but still, just 54 years old, dying in his hot tub. And for many people, we looked at this death, we're like, well, how exactly did that happen? Did he drown? Did he pass out? Was he drinking? Were there drugs involved? And the answers raised more questions about who's responsible. It was similar when Michael Jackson died. That was another tragic death. Michael Jackson, too, had issues. You know, his thing was he needed propofol and wanted propofol to go to sleep, to get that good rest that he always wanted. He called it his milk. And the death of Michael Jackson obviously could have been easily prevented if, in fact, the person administering the drugs improperly would have been paying attention instead of talking to his girlfriend all night on the phone. Well, that doctor, Dr. Conrad Murray, was prosecuted for what happened to Michael Jackson, and he served time. We covered the trial. So here we are now with Matthew Perry, and today, a little bit of an answer from prosecutors. 5 people have been charged. This is a federal case. And there was a press conference today where they spoke a lot about what happened, what they believe happened, and the evidence that they have in the case. But before I get to that, there are 5 people involved here, so I want to introduce you to them so you understand their alleged role in what happened to Matthew Perry. So let's take a look at this chart we've put together. We begin with Matthew Perry. All right, he's the victim in all this. He's the one who died from that acute effects of ketamine. Now, someone else who's involved is Kenneth Iwamasa. Kenneth is actually Matthew Perry's assistant, and one of the things that he's apparently doing, according to investigators, and he's entered a plea, he's obtaining ketamine from different sources. But he's not just obtaining the ketamine, he's also injecting his boss, Matthew Perry, with that ketamine. So let's take a look at the first source and the first place that Iwamasa is getting this ketamine. And we go to one of the third person involved here, Dr. Salvador Plasencia, also known as Dr. P. He allegedly injected Matthew Perry with ketamine, sort of training Kenneth in how to do it. He provided the ketamine and the equipment to Kenneth Iwamasa and taught him how to do it. So he would do the first injection, leave him with all the stuff, this is according to prosecutors, and then allow Kenneth to finish administering whatever ketamine was left over in the days that would follow. Now, there's someone connected to Dr. Salvador Plasencia, who is Dr. Mark Chavez, who sold ketamine to Dr. P. He also sold ketamine lozenges, fraudulent prescriptions, gloves, and syringes. So Dr. Mark Chavez is sort of supplying the supplies to the doctor, who is then giving them to the assistant who is administering it to Matthew Perry. That's one source of the ketamine. But apparently he may have been using a lot, so he needed more than one source. So we go to the 5th person in all of this, and the 4th person who's charged, Eric Fleming. He's basically one who negotiates and executes the ketamine purchases between Perry's assistant, Kenneth, and the alleged ketamine queen. And he was sort of a middleman, a broker, and he would take his $500 fee. So he's sort of arranging the whole deal between Kenneth and the ketamine queen, who is the final person you need to know about. Jasveen Senga is her name. She's known in North Hollywood as the ketamine queen and allegedly sells liquid ketamine in unmarked, unlabeled vials. And it's not clear where that ketamine is necessarily coming from. So those are the people involved. So now let's take a listen to the federal prosecutor here describe what they believe they uncovered here in figuring out how Matthew Perry was killed.
Following Mr. Perry's death in October of last year, law enforcement, my office, and our partners represented on this stage began an in-depth, wide-ranging investigation. That investigation has revealed a broad, underground criminal network responsible for distributing large quantities of ketamine to Mr. Perry and others. This network included a live-in assistant, various go-betweens, 2 medical doctors, and a major source of drug supply known as, quote, the ketamine queen. We charged 5 defendants in this matter. These defendants took advantage of Mr. Perry's addiction issues to enrich themselves. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew what they were doing was risking great danger to Mr. Perry, but they did it anyways. On October 28, 2023, Mr. Perry was found deceased in his home. An autopsy was conducted following his death. That autopsy showed that he had died due to the acute effects of ketamine. Ketamine is a controlled substance. It has some legitimate uses, but it is also used illegally. It is used by people seeking to disassociate from reality. It can cause serious health effects, serious health problems, including loss of consciousness, including spikes in blood pressure, and including respiratory issues that can deprive the brain of oxygen. For that reason, it is a drug that must be administered by medical professionals, and the patient must be monitored closely. That did not occur here. This investigation focused on who supplied the ketamine to Mr. Perry. The investigation revealed that in the fall of 2023, Mr. Perry fell back into addiction, and these defendants took advantage to profit for themselves. The 2 lead defendants in this case are defendants Salvador Plasencia and defendant Jasveen Sanya. First, I'll talk about defendant Plasencia. Defendant Plasencia was a medical doctor. He worked with another medical doctor, defendant Mark Chavez, to obtain ketamine. He then worked with Mr. Perry's live-in assistant, defendant Kenneth Iwamasa, to distribute that ketamine to Mr. Perry. Over 2 months, from September to October 2023, they distributed approximately 20 vials of ketamine to Mr. Perry in exchange for $55,000 in cash. Defendant Plasencia saw this as an opportunity to profit off of Mr. Perry. He wrote in a text message in September 2023, quote, "I wonder how much this moron will pay." He also stated in text messages that he wanted to be Mr. Perry's sole source of supply. He wrote in a text message that he wanted to be Mr. Perry's, quote, "go-to for drugs." As a doctor, defendant Plasencia knew full well the danger of what he was doing. In fact, on one occasion, he injected Mr. Perry with ketamine, and he saw Mr. Perry freeze up and his blood pressure spike. Despite that, he left additional vials of ketamine for defendant Iwamasa to administer to Mr. Perry. Of course, defendant Iwamasa had no medical training to speak of. Defendant Plasencia knew what he was doing was harming Mr. Perry. He had spoken to another patient in mid-October 2023, and he told that patient that Mr. Perry was spiraling out of control with his addiction. Nonetheless, defendant Placentia continued to offer ketamine to Mr. Perry. Likewise, defendant Sonia knew what she was doing was harming defendants and also Mr. Perry. She took advantage of Mr. Perry by selling large amounts of ketamine to Mr. Perry over a 2-week period in October of 2023. She sold approximately 50 vials of ketamine for approximately $11,000 in cash. She worked with a broker, defendant Eric Fleming, and also the live-in assistant, defendant Iwamasa, to distribute this ketamine. Sonia and the broker, defendant Fleming, saw this as an opportunity to profit off of Mr. Perry. In a text message, the broker wrote, quote, "I wouldn't do it if there wasn't a chance of me making some money for doing this." Defendant Sonia sold the batch of ketamine that resulted in Mr. Perry's death on October 28th. Officers later searched defendant Sonia's home. During that search, they found what amounted to a drug-selling emporium. They found 80 vials of ketamine, thousands of pills containing methamphetamine, cocaine, bottles of Xanax and other illegally obtained prescription drugs, and drug-selling paraphernalia, including scales and ledgers. As I mentioned, the defendants in this case knew what they were doing was wrong. When they'd refer to the ketamine, they used coded language. They'd refer to it using terms such as, quote, Dr. Pepper, or quote, bots, or quote, cans. Also, defendants Placentia and Chavez, as medical doctors, knew full well this was not the proper way to administer ketamine, and they even talked about that in their exchanges. And defendant Sonia also knew that she was doing something that caused great risk to Mr. Perry. In fact, during this investigation, we learned that several years before, in 2019, defendant Sonia had sold ketamine to another customer. That person died the same day. And a family member of that person sent a message to defendant Sonia telling her the cause of death was ketamine. Nonetheless, defendant Sonia continued selling drugs, including ketamine, including the ketamine that ultimately killed Mr. Perry. After Mr. Perry died, these defendants tried to cover up what they had done. On October 28th, after reading news reports of Mr. Perry's death, defendant Sonia wrote a text message to defendant Fleming saying, quote, delete all our messages. Likewise, after Mr. Perry's death, defendant Placentia falsified medical records and notes to try to make it look like what he was doing was legitimate. It was not.
Unbelievable. Let's bring in our think tank. Joining us tonight, criminal defense attorney Eklund Mercy. Also joining us, retired criminal defense attorney Kirk Nurmi and former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. Great to see everyone tonight. Tragic story. Obviously, it's very high profile because it's Matthew Perry, but this investigation uncovered some really nefarious things, especially when you see doctors involved in all of this and going after the so-called ketamine queen. But Nima, I want to begin with you as a former federal prosecutor. How do you see everyone's responsibility here? Because they had to flip some people, including the man who's injecting Matthew Perry, his assistant. So how do you see everyone's responsibility for what happened to Matthew Perry here?
Well, I think that at the top are the ketamine queen, right? Here's someone who allegedly killed someone in 2019, Cody McKellen, and was responsible for providing the fatal dose of ketamine that ended up killing Matthew Perry. So she's got to be at the top of my list. And of course, she's also distributing allegedly methamphetamine. So all of a sudden, she's looking at a potential life sentence in federal prison because she is now involved in 2 drug-related deaths on top of the methamphetamine. Then you got to look at the doctors, right? I mean, they took an oath to do no harm. And Not to say the drug dealers get a pass or the assistant gets a pass, but you're a medical doctor, right? You're taking advantage of someone with a serious, documented, public opioid addiction, right? They're taking bottles of ketamine that cost them $12, Vinny, and they're selling them for $2,000. And they're mocking him and laughing at him. So they're responsible for perpetuating his addiction. Let's not forget, ketamine is a liquid. It's supposed to be administered in a doctor's office through an IV. You don't give it to your patient to take home. You don't give it to his assistant. I mean, this is beyond the pale when it comes to medical care. And really, this is one of the reasons that although a lot of doctors swear by ketamine and say it helps anxiety and depression, there's a lot of people that think it's a dangerous drug. And it was once a horse tranquilizer, and it's now probably one of the most abused party drugs over the past 10 to 15 years.
Eklund Mercy, the reason I like high-profile cases like this and I like strong prosecutions because I believe in deterrence. Do you think the high-profile nature of this may deter someone from becoming the next ketamine queen or the next doctor from abusing their license?
Sorry, no. I think that if we have a demand, there will always be a supply. Unfortunately, Mr. Perry has had issues with addiction for decades, and it has been known for decades. Now, anybody who is familiar with people who have addictions, right, they understand that it doesn't matter what. If you have somebody who's addicted to something, they will move heaven and earth. It does not matter if it's $12 or $5,000, they will get that money. Now, the issue is that when you have somebody who has deep pockets, when you have somebody like Matthew Perry, the issue here is that the argument that they knew or knew of, it could be so that they were trying to protect him. Now, I've represented some people who, hey, they have high-end clients and high-end, people who need it. However, when you have that addiction and they don't have somebody that they can trust to get it, in their minds, they feel like they are protecting him from being murdered or being robbed or being what have you. So although they are talking about it, we've seen it often. It's like, this is not just a regular person off the street. He's friends. He is the friend. So he can't just go out on the street and say, can I get a little? No. So I think that they use that. Do I believe that it's connected to a murder? No. Do I believe that it's connected to his death? No. Unfortunately, those who have addictions understand, the end. Unfortunately, there's a bad end. But I believe it's a RICO case. But do I believe that it's connected to his death? No. He has been very vocal with his issues with addiction for decades. So I think it's going to be a hard hill to climb.
Kirk, do you see these defendants, the queen, the ketamine queen, and the doctors going after Matthew Perry, blaming him, blaming his assistant in all of this?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a tough road to hoe. I think their best defense, if you will, is to try to cut bait, to try to snitch, to try to get a plea, because we got her. And I think that that's probably what's going to happen, because we're calling these people doctors in the name they are. But let's face it, the way they were running the operation, they were drug dealers like any other that you might find on the street. They just happen to have white coats and MDs behind their name. So, they're going to be looking to scramble to save themselves. They're going to have that mentality. So I don't know that they have a good defense here, but it's going to be every drug dealer for themselves trying to get that plea offer.
Just like any other drug dealing case. Well put, Kirk. All right, Eklund Mercy, Kirk Nurmi, Nima Rahmani staying with us.